The courtroom was silent as the judge stared down at the man in front of him. He smirked, tapping his gavel on the desk. "So, you really think you can outsmart the law?" he scoffed. The black man stood still, his face calm, his hands folded. The audience whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, others chuckling under their breath. The judge leaned forward. "You people always think you can talk your way out of trouble," he said with a smirk. "But in my court, that won't work." The man didn't flinch. He just smiled. And what happened next made the entire courtroom freeze. The judge sighed loudly, flipping through the case file. "So, Mr. Johnson, you were caught trespassing in a private building, huh?" "Typical." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Let me guess, you were looking for a better opportunity? Or maybe you just couldn't help yourself?" The courtroom filled with quiet laughter. The man, still calm, simply nodded. "I was there for a reason, Your Honor," he said. The judge rolled his eyes. Yeah, they all say that." He leaned back in his chair. "Look, I don't need to hear any sob story. I've dealt with enough of your kind to know how this ends. You'll cry, you'll beg, and then I'll give you the sentence you deserve." The man didn't react. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small envelope. He held it up slowly. "Before you make your decision," he said, "maybe you should read this." The judge smirked, waving his hand. "Oh, I've read enough," he said. "I already know what I'm going to do." But as he spoke, one of the courtroom officers stepped forward, took the envelope, and handed it to him. The judge hesitated. The moment his eyes landed on the words inside, his face went pale. The judge's smirk disappeared. His fingers tightened around the paper as he read the words again, his eyes darting back to the man standing in front of him. The courtroom grew silent. People leaned forward, trying to see what had just shaken the confident judge. His hands trembled slightly as he looked up. This can't be right," he muttered under his breath. He swallowed hard and cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. The man remained calm, watching him closely. The audience whispered among themselves. The prosecutor frowned, confused by the judge's reaction. One of the officers standing near the judge peeked over his shoulder at the paper, his eyes widening in shock. "Sir, is everything okay?" he asked. The judge ignored him. His face turned red, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Slowly, he set the paper down and looked at the man again, this time without his arrogant smirk. Who are you?" he finally asked, his voice quieter than before. The man finally took a step forward. "My name is Daniel Johnson," he said, "and I am not the one on trial here today." The judge's breath caught in his throat. He knew that name. And now he knew exactly who he had just humiliated in front of the entire courtroom. The courtroom buzzed with confusion. People looked at each other, trying to piece together what was happening. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His arrogance was gone, replaced by something else. Fear. He licked his lips and forced a chuckle. "All right, Mr. Johnson. Or should I say Daniel Johnson," he said, his voice shaky. "You expect me to believe this nonsense?" He glanced at the officers in the room, expecting them to laugh along with him. But they didn't. One of the senior officers, who had been silent until now, took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "Daniel Johnson is the newly appointed state prosecutor." The room erupted. Gasps filled the air, and the judge's face turned ghostly white. He gripped the arms of his chair as if trying to steady himself. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. The man he had just mocked, belittled, and accused was not a criminal. He was the man who would soon have authority over cases like this. The judge opened his mouth, but no words came out. Daniel Johnson simply stood there, watching him. The calm expression on his face never changed. He didn't need to say anything. He had already won. The audience whispered furiously. Some people smirked, enjoying the irony of the moment. The same judge who had always abused his power had just humiliated himself in front of everyone. The judge cleared his throat, trying to regain control. This is some kind of mistake," he stammered. "Why would someone like you be standing here?" Daniel tilted his head slightly. "I came to observe," he said, his voice steady, "to see for myself how justice is being handled in this courtroom." He took a step closer, his eyes locking onto the judge's. "And now, I've seen enough." The judge's hand started to shake. His career, his reputation, everything was now at risk. And the worst part? There was nothing he could do to change it. The judge swallowed hard, gripping the gavel like it was the only thing keeping him steady. He forced a nervous smile. "Listen, Mr. Johnson, State Prosecutor Johnson, surely we can clear up this misunderstanding," he said, his voice cracking slightly. The audience chuckled. The same man who had just mocked and belittled Daniel was now stammering like a guilty criminal. Daniel didn't move. His gaze was firm, unshaken. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "No, Your Honor, I understood everything perfectly." He gestured toward the courtroom. "I saw how you judged people before even hearing them. I saw how you assumed I was guilty, just because of the way I look." The room fell silent. Some people lowered their heads, realizing the truth in his words. The judge licked his lips, trying to regain control. "Now, hold on, I was just following protocol. This is a high-pressure job, you understand." He was scrambling. He knew that if Daniel reported him, it could mean an investigation, maybe even disbarment. Daniel finally took another step closer, standing right in front of the judge's bench. He lowered his voice, but his words cut deep. "Justice isn't about power," he said. "It's about fairness, about treating people with dignity, no matter who they are." He placed his hands on the desk and leaned in slightly. "And after what I saw today, you don't deserve to sit in that chair." The judge's face turned red. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. He knew it was over. The power he had always used against others had just crumbled in his own hands. The judge's hands trembled as he clutched the gavel, his once confident smirk completely gone. The entire courtroom was watching, waiting to see what Daniel Johnson would do next. The power shift was undeniable. Just minutes ago, the judge had been the one looking down at Daniel, treating him like he was nothing. Now the roles had reversed. Daniel took a deep breath, then turned to the courtroom officers. "I want this case dismissed," he said firmly. The officers didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir." One of them immediately stepped forward and ripped the case file in half right in front of the judge. Gasps filled the room. The judge's eyes widened. "Wait, you can't just—" "I can," Daniel interrupted. "And I did." He turned back to the judge. "You thought this was just another day in court, another chance to humiliate someone you believed was beneath you." He tilted his head slightly. "How does it feel now?" The judge opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was no comeback, no clever remark, just silence. Daniel took a step back and adjusted his suit. "I will be reviewing the cases that have gone through your courtroom," he continued. "Every single one. If I find any evidence of bias, any wrongful convictions, any abuse of power—" He let the sentence hang. He didn't need to finish it. The judge already knew what that meant. Beads of sweat rolled down the judge's face. His mind raced. This wasn't just about one moment of embarrassment. This was about his entire career. If Daniel followed through with his promise, it could mean the end of everything he had built. But there was nothing he could do. The courtroom remained silent as Daniel gave one final look at the judge. Then, with the same calm expression he had worn the entire time, he turned and walked out. The crowd slowly parted as he passed. Some people whispered, others nodded with respect. The judge? He just sat there, frozen, powerless, completely exposed. As Daniel stepped outside the courthouse, he took a deep breath, feeling the cool air hit his face. The weight of the moment settled in. Not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly in that courtroom. Today wasn't just about him winning. It was about changing the system. Behind him, the doors swung open, and a small group of people rushed out. Some were defendants who had been waiting for their own trials. Others were lawyers who had watched the entire scene unfold. A young man, barely in his 20s, ran up to Daniel, his voice shaky. "Sir, I just wanted to say thank you." Daniel turned to him, eyebrows raised. "For what?" The young man swallowed hard. "I was supposed to stand trial today, but after what you did, maybe I'll finally get a fair chance." His voice cracked slightly. "Guys like me, we never get a fair chance." Daniel studied him for a moment, then placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You do now." The young man nodded, his eyes glassy with emotion. A few others behind him murmured their thanks. Some shook his hand. Others just stood there, taking in the reality of what had happened. One moment of justice had given them hope. Meanwhile, back inside, the judge sat at his bench, still gripping his gavel like it was the last thing holding his world together. He stared at the empty courtroom, at the broken case file in front of him. The same gavel he had used to silence and sentence so many people now felt useless in his hands. For the first time in his career, he felt small. As Daniel walked away from the courthouse, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had made his point. Justice had spoken. And this time, it was on the right side of history.